A wealthy and powerful man, obsessed with status and appearances, makes an unthinkable choice. He abandons his twin sons, only 3 years old and both with disabilities, in the middle of a forest, walking away as if they never existed. What could drive a father to such cruelty? And what happens when time, fate, and the strength of the human spirit turn pain into something far greater? What unfolds over the next 30 years will lead to a confrontation that no one could ever predict. This is Millionaire leaves his 3-year-old disabled son in the forest and walks away 30 years later. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. This is another emotional journey from Golden Stories, where you truly feel the weight of life-changing stories. Claudio yanked the handbrake with a snap and stepped out of the car with rigid movements, his jaw clenched as if bracing for something repugnant. He moved to the back door, opened it swiftly, and reached in to pull the small body of his 3-year-old son, Elian, from the seat. The child didn't resist. His limp legs dragged as Claudio lifted him by one arm, unbothered by the boy's imbalance or the way his tiny feet twisted awkwardly in the air. Elian's head lolled slightly to the side, the result of a congenital condition that weakened his muscles, something Claudio had never been able to accept. The boy made a sound, not quite a cry, more of a questioning hum, as if asking why his father looked at him like that. "Stop staring like that. You don't even understand what's going on," Claudio muttered under his breath, though the anger in his tone betrayed his unease. The child instinctively reached for his father's coat, fingers trembling, seeking comfort or perhaps just something familiar. But Claudio jerked his arm away with disgust and shoved the boy to the ground with a sudden, unforgiving thrust. Elian's knees hit the dirt, his fragile frame crumbling silently. Claudio stood over the child for a long moment, breathing heavily, as though trying to convince himself this was necessary. His tailored shoes sank slightly into the earth, but he didn't seem to notice. All he saw was the small figure now sitting in the dirt, blinking slowly, confused, but not crying. Elian never cried. His silence had always unnerved Claudio more than any tantrum ever could. The boy's tilted head and distant gaze felt like a mirror to Claudio's own cowardice, and that made him furious. He turned away, paced for a few seconds, then came back, crouched, and grabbed the child's chin roughly. "You listen to me if you can even understand," he hissed. "You don't belong in my world. You never did. This is better for both of us." Elian whimpered softly, his lips parting as if to speak, but no words came, only a soft rasp of breath. Claudio stood again, wiped his hands on a handkerchief like he had touched something unclean, and began walking back to the car without another word. He opened the driver's door but paused, glancing once more at the boy, who hadn't moved. Something inside him twitched. Regret, perhaps, but it was too late now. He had made his choice. If he didn't leave now, he never would. "You'll figure it out," he muttered to no one, then slammed the door shut. The engine roared to life, and the vehicle sped off, disappearing down the narrow, unpaved road that cut through the forest. Elian remained seated, his small form barely distinguishable, among the overgrown weeds and thick roots surrounding him. He didn't cry, he didn't call out, he simply sat, his head tilted, watching the darkness where the car had vanished. The boy's mind, still too young to grasp the fullness of betrayal, tried to make sense of the stillness. The only warmth he had ever known had driven away, leaving him in a place that smelled of rot and mold and things that crawled. Hours passed, or minutes. Time held no meaning for someone like Elian, whose understanding of the world was limited to brief flashes of sensation and vague impressions of safety or danger. He crawled forward a few inches, his knees scraping the soil, his fingers probing the moss-covered ground. Every movement was an effort. His body simply didn't obey him the way other children's did. He remembered the color of the car. He remembered the back seat, the texture of the upholstery, and the way his father had been silent the entire ride, not saying a single word. That silence had been heavier than any scream. His stomach growled faintly, a hollow complaint that echoed within his thin frame. He looked up. Trees surrounded him like tall, angry men, their arms tangled high above, letting only fragments of light reach him. The world had become a cage, and he had no map, no tools, no voice, but he had breath. That breath turned into a whimper, then a short moan as he struggled to stand on legs that betrayed him. He fell again. He began to crawl with no destination in mind. His hands, soft and uncalloused, turned red from friction. A thorn scraped his cheek. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't even know what going meant. But his body, feeble as it was, knew it could not stay. Something instinctual, perhaps older than memory, drove him forward. Somewhere in his underdeveloped mind, the echo of footsteps still lingered, as if his father might return, scoop him up and say it was all a mistake. That hope lingered, flickering weakly, but it fueled the slow, painful journey. The underbrush snagged at his clothes. Insects landed on him without fear. He murmured nonsense sounds to himself, soft fragments of syllables he had learned in the safety of a room he would never see again. "Pa," he whispered, "Pa." But no one came. Only the trees listened. At one point, Elian stopped crawling and pressed his cheek to the cold earth. His breath came in shallow gulps. Hunger gnawed at his belly. But what frightened him more was the realization that he could no longer hear any familiar sounds. No television humming in the background, no voices arguing in other rooms, no footsteps from the hallway. Just the emptiness of this place. A vast nothingness filled with strange scents and textures. His fingers found a leaf, and he held it like it was a doll, rubbing it against his face. He needed something to feel close to, something to pretend was still warm. The ground pulsed faintly beneath him. An illusion, maybe. He imagined it was his mother's heartbeat, though. He had no memory of her, only the idea of her, perhaps inherited from vague gestures he had once seen. He closed his eyes and waited, not for rescue, not even for sleep, just waited for anything. Somewhere deep in the foliage, a rustle snapped him back. Elian lifted his head, alert despite his fatigue. His fingers dug into the dirt as if to anchor himself. He didn't know what he had heard. A creature, a person. He had no way of knowing, but he knew one thing. Something else existed here, and it had noticed him. He held his breath, his body freezing in place. The noise stopped. Minutes passed. He tried to call out, but his voice had grown hoarse and weak. His lips parted, but nothing emerged. He wanted to disappear, blend into the ground, become a rock or a leaf or anything invisible. But he was still just a boy, small, sickly, alone. And now he was also being watched. The first night didn't end. It simply blurred into a continuation of the same horror. Elian's mind, deprived of comfort and routine, began to falter. He whispered stories to himself, nonsense tales about birds and lights and someone who would come looking. But the more he whispered, the less he believed them. He dug a shallow hole beside a tree trunk and curled into it, as if it were a nest. Sleep came not as relief but as defense, an escape into unconsciousness. Somewhere between dreams and hunger, he saw his father's face again, but this time Claudio looked away from him, faceless, fading. The rejection now burned deeper than any cold or pain, and Elian, even without knowing the word for it, felt shame for existing. That shame would grow like roots in his chest, coiling tight and silent, feeding on every year that would follow. Elian didn't notice the man approaching until a pair of heavy boots stopped inches from his face. "Well, what do we have here?" a voice said, low and thick with false kindness. The boy blinked up slowly, his body too weak to recoil. The man knelt beside him, bringing his face close. He wore a worn, brown hat, tilted just enough to cast a shadow over his eyes, but his smile was wide and too white to feel real. "You're a quiet little thing, aren't you?" he continued. brushing dirt from Elian's cheek with a finger that trembled slightly from age or perhaps restraint. "Are you lost, boy?" Elian didn't answer. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He was too tired, too confused. The man's hand moved to the boy's back, lifting him as if handling something fragile and filthy all at once. "Let's get you somewhere safe, huh? Somewhere warm. I'll take care of you. Norberto always takes care of the forgotten ones," he said, his voice almost theatrical. Elian leaned against him because there was no other option. He didn't recognize the threat yet. To him, Norberto was just a man who hadn't walked away. The truck was old and loud, but Norberto made a show of wiping the passenger seat with his sleeve before setting Elian down. "Don't worry, it's clean enough. Cleaner than you, at least," he chuckled, then added, "Just joking, kid. You'll be clean soon enough." As they drove, Norberto glanced at him frequently, studying his condition like one would evaluate merchandise. "You're a bit broken, huh? Legs not working right, and that head tilt. What is that nerve damage?" he mused aloud, though he didn't expect or wait for an answer. "Don't worry, I know people who'll know what to do with you." Elian looked at the trees passing by, his gaze distant. He didn't understand everything, but his body remained tense, unsure. He remembered being shoved, left behind. This man hadn't done that. That alone made him better. For now. "You hungry?" Norberto asked suddenly, pulling out a crumpled piece of bread from the dashboard. "Here, eat. Gotta keep you." "Alive, don't we?" Elian took it slowly, more out of instinct than trust. Norberto smiled again, a bit too wide. "That's it. Good boy." The road to Baicose was long and winding, unpaved and riddled with potholes that jolted the truck violently. Norberto whistled tunelessly as he drove, tapping the steering wheel with a rhythm that didn't match the bumps. "Not much to look at out here, but wait till you see the village. You'll love it. Everyone there's got a story, just like you. Except they owe me. That's the difference," he said with a laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. Elian sat silently, the bread untouched on his lap now. The boy stared at the man's hands, large and worn, veins like ropes under his skin. He didn't like the way Norberto's eyes shifted too quickly, or how his mouth kept moving even when he wasn't speaking. There was something off, but Elian lacked the language to describe it. He only had feeling, and it felt wrong. Still, he stayed seated, body rigid, heart unsure. When they finally pulled into the village, Norberto announced, "Welcome to Baixo. It ain't heaven, but it ain't hell. Not for me, anyway." Baixo was a collection of crooked houses, some made of wood, others of patched-together materials that defied logic. The streets were mud and stone, littered with discarded toys, plastic bags, and people who didn't look up when the truck passed. Norberto waved at a few with a mock cheerfulness. "Morning, Elsa. Still breathing, You see, good for you." He parked beside a shack larger than the others, surrounded by makeshift fences and stray dogs. "Home, sweet home," he said, opening Elian's door and lifting him out again. "Let's get you cleaned up, little prince." Inside, the air was thick and stale. There were mattresses on the floor, stained and torn, and a small stove sputtering with uncertain fire. Norberto placed Elian on a bench and began stripping off the boy's dirty clothes. "Can't have you smelling like the forest," he said, already filling a bucket with water. Elian tensed. His hands gripped the bench tightly, but he didn't resist. Something about Norberto's touch wasn't quite right, but he didn't know how to escape it. "You're mine now," Norberto whispered, not loud enough to frighten, but just loud enough to claim. Over the next few days, Norberto made a show of caring. He gave Elian clothes that didn't fit, food that was barely edible, and a blanket too thin for the cold nights. But he smiled constantly, told stories about his youth, about how he rescued children all the time. "You're lucky I found you, you know. Out there, you wouldn't have lasted another day. You were a breath away from being bones." Elian nodded when Norberto expected it, sat still when told, ate when ordered. He became quiet, observing. Norberto let him explore the shack and even introduced him to two other children, older, with guarded eyes and silent mouths. They didn't speak to Elian, but they looked at him with something that felt like warning. One of them had a scar on his neck that looked like it had been stitched up in the dark. Elian stared too long, and the boy shook his head slowly as if to say, "Don't ask." One night, Elian woke to footsteps and the creak of a door. Norberto's voice whispered, "Shh, it's okay," before the man knelt beside his mattress. His hand brushed the boy's arm in a gesture too lingering to be innocent. Elian froze, his body rigid with a terror he couldn't name. Norberto whispered again, "Just making sure you're safe. Gotta look after my treasures, right?" He smiled, in the dark, teeth gleaming faintly. Then he stood and left, but Elian didn't sleep after that. He stared at the ceiling until morning. The image of that smile burned into his mind. He knew something now. This wasn't a rescue. This was something else, something worse, and there was no car to run back. To no father, no forest, just this man and his smile. The days that followed blurred into a routine of obedience and silence. Elian was given chores, minor ones at first, sweeping, sorting, watching the fire, but the rules were clear. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't touch what isn't yours. Don't leave the house without permission. Norberto never hit him, not yet. But Elian had seen how he grabbed the older boy by the collar when he broke a plate, slamming him into the wall so hard the plaster cracked. "Do you want to end up in the ground like the last one?" Norberto had hissed, eyes gleaming with rage before turning calm again, like nothing happened. Elian learned quickly. He kept his head down, answered with nods, stayed useful, but his mind didn't rest. Every night he stared at the door, hoping someone would come, and every night he realized no one would. Not here, not in Baixo. Then came the first test. Norberto called him over during dinner, the three children seated on the floor while he ate at the table. "Elian, come here." The boy stood, trembling. Norberto handed him a coin. "Go to Donna Lucia's. Get me tobacco. Tell her Norberto sent you." It was the first time he was being allowed outside alone. The air outside felt different, heavier, not freer. People stared. Some pitied, others smirked. At Donna Lucia's window, the old woman leaned in. "You one of his now?" she asked. Elian didn't answer. She sighed and handed over the small pouch. "Poor thing. You'll learn or you'll break." He didn't understand, but her tone pierced him. When he returned, Norberto smiled. "Good boy, obedient. We'll make something useful out of you yet." And in that moment, Elian realized he hadn't been rescued. He'd been claimed. "Faster, boy, before someone sees you hesitating," Norberto snapped, shoving Elian forward with a force that nearly sent him tumbling into the street. Elian, now 8 but still small for his age, stumbled with the familiar awkwardness of his weakened legs, but caught himself before falling. The rough satchel swung against his hip, already half filled with stolen goods, fruit, trinkets, whatever Norberto had pointed at through clenched teeth. "Don't come back empty-handed again, you little bastard," the man hissed, grabbing Elian by the collar and yanking him close. "You think I feed you for nothing?" Elian didn't answer. He never did. He simply nodded, lips tight, eyes locked on the cracked sidewalk. He'd learned long ago that speaking only brought more slaps, more yelling, and sometimes worse. He turned, clutching the satchel, and walked toward the market square, his gait uneven but determined. He had a list in his mind: 3 apples, 2 tins of sardines, and whatever jewelry he could pocket from the cloth stand near the alley. Norberto had timed it all. If Elian took too long, he'd be punished. If he came back with too little, he'd be punished. If he ran, well, he knew what would happen if he ran. The market was alive with bodies, voices, colors, and yet to Elian it was a battlefield. Every stall was an obstacle, every eye a potential accuser. He knew who watched closely and who turned their heads. He knew which vendors kept knives under their tables and which let things slip into the hands of children too thin to fight for anything else. As he passed a fruit cart, the vendor, a thick-necked man with sweat-stained clothes, spotted him. "Hey, You again? He barked. Elian froze, his hand halfway to an apple. Get away from my cart, rat! I've seen you before! Go steal from someone else. A few people turned to look, and Elian's face burned with shame. The man didn't stop there. You work for that devil in the hat, don't you? Norberto's little pet thief. Elian backed away, the apple forgotten. A girl around his age, standing near a stand of ribbons, pointed at him and laughed. He walks funny, she said, loud enough for others to hear. Her friends giggled, and one of them mimicked Elian's limp. Look, I'm Norberto's dog, the boy barked, crawling in circles, and the laughter grew louder. Elian's throat tightened, but he said nothing. He turned and walked away. Behind a butcher's stall, Elian crouched low and waited for the shouting to pass. He counted slowly, something he did to stay calm. 1, 2, 3, up to 20, then start again. It didn't help the anger, though. The anger always stayed. It pressed behind his ribs like a stone. That wouldn't move. He thought about clawing the mocking boy's face, about taking a rock to the fruit vendor's head, but he didn't move. He didn't fight. He didn't speak. He just stared at the edge of the butcher's boot, imagining blood and silence. When the coast was clear, he darted toward the alley behind the cloth stand, where the merchant's daughter often left silver pins unattended on a low shelf. He reached under the table, fingers nimble, and pulled one out, slipping it into his satchel. He took another and another. Suddenly a hand grabbed his arm. Thought I smelled a thief. Oh, you voice growled. The merchant's son, a boy of 16, yanked Elian out from under the table and slammed him against the wooden post. Look what we have here. Elian's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His lip bled where his tooth had cut it on impact. The boy held him up like a trophy. Let's show the others what Norberto sends to rob us. They dragged him to the center of the square. No one stopped them. Some watched. Some smiled. One woman said, "Leave him alone, he's just a kid," but did nothing else. The older boy pushed Elian to his knees, then kicked the satchel across the cobblestones. The stolen pins spilled out like confessions. "Dirty little thief," he spat. "You think we're stupid?" Elian wiped the blood from his lip with the back of his hand. His eyes didn't blink. His face remained still. Inside, though, something had cracked. Not like before. This wasn't fear. This was something colder. He looked at every face that laughed. He memorized them. The girl with the ribbons, the butcher's wife, the man with the thick neck. Every detail, every sneer. Someday he would return. Someday they'd see him, and they would be the ones on their knees. The boy kicked him again, hard in the ribs, but Elian didn't cry out. He simply stared at the sky, at the idea of somewhere far away from this village, this world. The boy grew bored and left him there. Elian slowly got up, gathered the spilled items, and limped back to Norberto's shack. Norberto didn't wait for him to explain. The man was already drunk and angry by the time Elian returned. "You think you're clever, huh? You let them catch you like a damn idiot?" he screamed, hurling a bottle that missed Elian's head by inches. "You embarrassed me. You made me look weak." Elian opened the satchel and showed the pin. "They didn't take them," he said, voice barely audible. Norberto stared at the contents, grabbed the boy by the shirt, and dragged him into the back room. "You think that makes up for it? You think your little limp gives you permission to screw up?" He beat Elian with a belt. 4 lashes, then 5, then 7. The boy didn't scream. He bit down on his own tongue so hard he tasted blood again. Afterward, Norberto threw him into the mattress and left. Elian lay there in the dark, eyes open, his skin burning, his mind racing. He didn't cry. He couldn't anymore. Something inside him was shifting, growing sharper. The pain didn't make him want to hide. It made him want to destroy. Over the following months, Elian became more efficient. He knew who to rob, when to smile, when to vanish. He stopped speaking to the other children. He watched everything, learned how people moved, how they lied. He memorized patterns, studied weakness. Norberto noticed. "You're becoming useful," he said one night. ruffling Elian's hair with something almost like affection. "You keep this up. Maybe I'll let you in on the real business." Elian nodded, but inside he imagined Norberto's hand broken. Imagined pushing him down the stone stairs outside the shack. Imagined lighting the whole place on fire and watching it burn with Norberto inside. These thoughts didn't scare him. They comforted him. He had nothing else. No mother, no father, no name anyone respected. But he had his thoughts, and in them he was not a victim. In them he was a storm. One evening, after a particularly humiliating scolding from a bakery owner who shoved him into the mud for loitering, Elian sat alone behind the chapel ruins at the edge of Baixoseu. He held a rusted coin in his hand, flipping it over and over. "One day I'll come back. They'll all see," he whispered to himself. "They'll remember my face. They'll beg." His voice trembled with a conviction he didn't fully understand yet. The idea of revenge no longer scared him. It felt right. It felt like survival. He imagined his father, too, wherever that man was, living in some house with clean floors and quiet nights, pretending his son didn't exist. Elian squeezed the coin so tightly it left an imprint in his palm. "You left me to rot," he whispered. "You all did." That night, he made a vow. He would never be weak again. He would never crawl again. Not for Norberto, not for the village, not for anyone. "You have 3 minutes. Don't touch the safe yet. Go for the drawer on the right," whispered Marcos, pressing the earpiece tighter against his ear. Elian didn't answer. He was already moving, a shadow among shadows, his body trained to obey instinct, not voices. At 14, he was no longer the limping child ridiculed in the streets of Baixoseu. His stride was balanced now, precise, legs reinforced by years of silent training, pain, and survival. Inside the abandoned wing of the Municipal Records building, he crept along the corridor like a ghost, avoiding the beams of the malfunctioning security system. He wore gloves, a thin hoodie, and a small toolkit strapped to his belt. The drawer was exactly where Marcos said it would be. Elian knelt, picked the lock in under 15 seconds and slid it open. Inside, folders, dozens of them. He rifled through them, ignoring everything that didn't bear a seal or a political name. Then he saw it. Valença Claudio Confidential. The name hit him like a slap. His fingers hesitated for half a second. Then he grabbed the folder and tucked it into his backpack without reading it. That would come later. Now, he had to disappear like he always did. "Did you get it?" Marcos asked when Elian emerged behind the old train station 2 blocks from the building. "Yeah," Elian muttered, tossing the bag at his feet. "Good," Marcos said, unzipping it. "Damn, you weren't kidding." Elian didn't care about Marcos's reaction. He didn't care about the money they'd get or the bribes those documents could leverage. He only cared about the name he'd seen. That name. The same name that had haunted his earliest memories, his first rejection, his first abandonment. He took the folder back from Marcos and opened it himself. The pages inside were damning. Financial transfers to offshore accounts, falsified reports, property acquisitions under shell corporations, all signed or authorized by Claudio Valença, now a revered senator and presidential hopeful. Elian's jaw clenched as he flipped through page after page of proof. The bastard hadn't just climbed the ladder, he'd stepped on others to do it, including his own blood. "You know who this guy is?" Marcos asked, chewing on a cigarette filter. Elian looked up slowly, his voice low. "He's my father." Marcos laughed at first, thinking it was a joke. Then, when Elian didn't smile, his laughter stopped. "Well, shit." Later that night, alone in the 1-bedroom flat he shared with Marcos and 2 other street kids, Elian sat cross-legged on the floor, the documents spread out before him. He read every word, memorizing details, internalizing numbers, names, and dates. His eyes were cold, focused. The boy who once crawled through the mud of Baixoseu was gone. In his place was someone else, someone forged in hate and silence. For years he had believed his father was dead, or at least irrelevant. Norberto had never confirmed or denied anything. "Don't ask about the past, it doesn't feed you," the man used to say. But now Elian knew the truth. Claudio Valenza hadn't vanished. He had risen. He had replaced shame with prestige, guilt with power, and worst of all, he'd gotten away with it. Elian leaned back against the wall and stared at the ceiling. The thought of confronting Claudio didn't frighten him. What scared him was the possibility that the man still wouldn't remember him, that he wouldn't even recognize the son he had once left for dead. That fear settled inside Elian like ice, but he didn't flinch. He wouldn't let that be the end of the story. He began building a timeline. Every transaction had a date, every signature a pattern. He marked each connection on the wall with chalk, using a stolen ruler to draw straight lines between points. The wall became a web, and at the center of it all, Claudio. Elian read interviews, watched videos, followed press conferences online. He mimicked the man's voice, studied the way he held his hands during speeches. He noted the words Claudio repeated: integrity, family, legacy, lies, all of it. Elian knew the truth. He had lived the truth, and now he had the evidence to prove it. But revenge wouldn't come from a press leak or a courtroom. That would be too clean, too quick. Elian didn't want justice. He wanted destruction. "You're not a boy anymore," he whispered to himself. "You're a weapon." The phrase stuck. He repeated it each night like a prayer. Each whisper made him colder. Each repetition made him stronger. One morning, Elian stood before a mirror and studied his reflection. He didn't look like Claudio. His skin was darker, his features sharper, inherited from a mother he never knew. But in his eyes, there was something, a flicker of the same arrogance, the same fire. "You left me to die," he whispered to his reflection. "Now you'll see what you created." He tore the documents into smaller pieces and reassembled them in a new binder, one that only he would control. Marcos didn't ask questions anymore. He knew Elian was on a different path. "Just don't get yourself killed," he said one night, tossing him a burner phone. Elian took it without a word. He'd already started calling journalists anonymously, planting questions at public events, sending copies of financial transfers to government watchdogs under false names. He wanted Claudio to feel the ground shake before he saw the avalanche. A slow unraveling, a haunting. Elian didn't want his father dead, not yet. He wanted him paranoid, sleepless, wondering which secret would surface next. And then, when the fear was ripe, he'd make himself known. At a fundraising gala 2 weeks later, Elian stood across the street from the venue, dressed in a stolen suit, clean-shaven, eyes hidden behind tinted glasses. Claudio emerged from a black car, surrounded by security and handshakes, cameras flashing. Elian watched from the shadows. He didn't move, didn't blink. Then, from his coat pocket, he pulled out a small envelope. Inside was a photo, an old one, a child maybe 3 years old, sitting in the dirt, eyes tilted, mouth slightly open, limbs thin and twisted. He slipped the photo into an unmarked envelope with the message, "Do you remember where you left him?" and handed it to a waiter. Headed toward the gala entrance. "Give it to Senator Valenza, urgent," he said. The man nodded, oblivious. Elian turned and walked away, heart steady. The game had begun. By the time Claudio opened the envelope that night, his hands had begun to shake. He said nothing to the people around him. He excused himself and went to the restroom, where he stared at the photo in silence. Something about the eyes haunted him. He didn't recognize the face, not clearly, but something in his gut twisted. He shoved the photo into his jacket and splashed water on his face. "It's nothing," he told himself. But the whisper didn't convince him. That night, he barely slept. In the days that followed, he started seeing things, people staring too long, shadows that felt familiar, voices that echoed memories he had buried deep. Elian watched from a distance, documenting every crack in his father's composure. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't finished. This was only the beginning, and he would not stop until Claudio Valenza's name meant nothing but disgrace, until his power turned to ash. "Elian, where the hell did you get these?" Norberto's eyes scanned the documents spread out across the grimy table, hands trembling slightly with a mixture of greed and disbelief. The dim light bulb above their heads flickered, casting sharp shadows over the faces of the two men. Elian stood with arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "They're real," he said, his voice cold and measured. "And they're enough to burn down an empire." Norberto lifted one of the pages, fingers brushing over the senator's signature. Offshore accounts, front companies, embezzlement trails. It was a treasure trove. "This is gold. We could sell this, you and me, blackmail the bastard, or leak it to someone high up and get immunity. You want in on that?" he asked, eyes gleaming. Elian shook his head. "No." Norberto frowned. "No? What do you mean, no?" Elian leaned in, eyes locked onto Norberto's. I'm selling this. I'm not giving it to anyone. I'll take him down myself, publicly, personally. I want him to lose everything, not just power. I want his mind to unravel. I want him to feel hunted." Norberto let out a low whistle, leaning back in his chair. "You're serious?" Elian's silence was his only answer. Over the next few days, Elian disappeared from Norberto's shack, refusing to tell anyone where he went or what he was doing. He no longer needed Norberto. What he needed now was precision. His first move was simple: a courier envelope delivered to Claudio Valenza's private residence, containing nothing but an old photograph of a malnourished child in tattered clothes, sitting in the dirt with wide, tilted eyes. No note, no sender, just the image. He waited. Within hours, the senator's office cancelled 2 meetings, citing urgent personal matters. Elian was watching from a distance, seated in the back of a small rented car across the boulevard. Through binoculars, he watched Claudio pace in front of the window, phone pressed to his ear, face pale. Elian smiled faintly. The cracks had begun. The next day, Claudio's driver found a message scratched into the windshield of the car. "You forgot something in the woods." The man showed it to his boss, who dismissed it publicly but doubled the security staff around his mansion. Elian noted it all in a small leather notebook. The hunt wasn't about speed, it was about pressure. He had time, and Claudio had a legacy to lose. Inside his office, Claudio barked orders at his assistant, his tone more erratic than usual. "I want records on that envelope. Who handled it? Where it came from? Every single person who touched it," he snapped, tossing the photo onto the desk. The assistant flinched. "Yes, Senator, of course." Claudio rubbed his temples. "The image, it couldn't be a coincidence. It couldn't be random. It was too precise. He remembered the boy. Or at least, the moment he had decided the boy no longer existed. That decision had been buried for over a decade. No one knew. No one could have known. And yet here it was, the child's face like a ghost staring back. At home, he locked his bedroom door for the first time in years. He triple-checked the alarm systems. He started seeing unfamiliar faces in every crowd. At dinner, with political allies, his hands shook so much he spilled wine on a diplomat's sleeve. "You look tired, Claudio," the man said with a laugh. Claudio forced a smile, but the panic under his skin kept pulsing. He hadn't felt fear in years. Now it followed him everywhere. Elian sent the second envelope 3 days later. This time, it contained a scanned copy of Claudio's first offshore bank transaction from years ago, signed with his full name. No message, no context. Just a copy. It arrived in the senator's official mailbox at the government building, timed perfectly for his secretary to find it first. Whispers began immediately. Claudio tried to stay, composed, issuing statements about political sabotage, blaming the opposition. But his hands were trembling even during interviews. He fired 2 staffers without cause, installed surveillance cameras in his private office. Elian watched it all unfold online, sitting in a cafe in another city, sipping coffee like a tourist. He didn't care about the political fallout. He only cared about the fear in Claudio's eyes. He sent more messages. An old drawing made by a child's hand with the word "Pa" scrawled in crooked letters. A charred teddy bear with a note that read, "You left more than ashes." Every item hit the mark. Claudio began losing weight. He lost sleep. His public image wavered. Elian wanted the world to see the descent. He wasn't just haunting a man, he was exposing the rot behind the mask. At night, Claudio started locking himself in his study with a revolver on the desk. He dismissed his wife's concerns with grunts and excuses, but she knew something was wrong. "You're scaring me," she told him once, voice shaking. He waved her off. "It's political garbage. I'm being targeted." But deep down, he knew better. He began to dream of the forest again, dreams he hadn't had in years. The cries of something small and helpless, the sound of footsteps walking away. Sometimes he woke up gasping, clawing at the sheets. Elian kept the pressure consistent, never too much at once, just enough to unbalance. He hacked into the senator's private schedule and changed appointments. To make Claudio miss key meetings, he manipulated emails to spark suspicion between the senator and his allies. Everything was subtle, untraceable. Elian had spent years learning systems, observing corruption from the gutters of society. Now he used those tools to twist the knife slowly. He wasn't trying to kill Claudio. Not yet. He was trying to erase his certainty, to make him doubt everything and everyone. When Elian broke into the senator's countryside property one night, he didn't steal anything. He left a single handprint on the bathroom mirror, covered in red paint, smeared just enough to resemble blood. Claudio found it the next morning and collapsed onto the floor, sobbing. He ordered the staff to be replaced, the cameras reviewed. No one saw anything. No one could explain how someone had gotten in. That day, Claudio cancelled a press conference and issued a vague statement about reassessing personal priorities. Elian was already back in the city by then, watching the news on a cheap motel television. He didn't feel triumph, not yet. He was still gathering strength, still sharpening the blade. But he knew now that Claudio Valenza, the untouchable, was cracking. The monster had a heartbeat, and Elian could hear it faltering. On the anniversary of the night he was abandoned, Elian left one final message, for now. A single USB drive hand-delivered to Claudio's secretary. It contained no threats, no demands, just a video. A boy, limping slightly, walking barefoot across broken pavement, eyes straight ahead, camera zooming slowly as he turned to face the lens. He said nothing. He didn't have to. His face said everything. The image cut to black. Claudio dropped the drive, clutching his chest, and whispered, "It's him." From that moment on, Claudio started taking sleeping pills, skipped public events, and began preparing secret contingency plans in case he needed to flee the country. But it was too late. Elian had already entered the bloodstream of his enemy's world. He didn't need weapons. He was the weapon, and the game had only just begun. "Who's been in my office?" Claudio shouted, slamming his hand on the desk hard enough to rattle the framed photo of his family. The security chief flinched, but stood his ground. "No one without clearance, sir. We checked all access logs. Only your wife and personal assistant entered, and both were accompanied." Claudio glared at the man, veins pulsing on his temple. "Then explain this." He shoved a printed photo forward. Another one slipped between official reports that morning. A picture of a young boy standing in front of a burned-out shack. His limbs were thin, twisted, head slightly tilted. The photo was old, but the eyes stared right into him. "You think this is a coincidence?" Claudio's voice cracked with something between rage and fear. The guard hesitated. "Could be political harassment, sir. We have enemies." Claudio leaned forward. "That's not harassment. That's a message. Someone got inside, and none of you saw it." The security chief didn't respond. He knew the man before him wasn't just angry, he was unraveling. Claudio dismissed him with a wave, then sat down heavily. He stared at the photo, jaw locked, chest heaving. "It's him," he whispered to no one. "He's alive." Security cameras were installed in every corner of the mansion, hallways, windows, even bathrooms. Guards patrolled the perimeter 24/7, and a cybersecurity firm was hired to monitor every email, every call. Yet Claudio felt no safer. He kept curtains closed, lights dimmed, and doors locked even during the day. His wife Helena watched in silence, unsure whether to argue or pretend it was all politics. "You haven't eaten," she said softly one evening, placing a tray beside him. Claudio didn't look up from the monitor screen where he rewound footage for the 6th time. "He's been here. I know it." Helena hesitated. "Who, Claudio?" His eyes narrowed. "A mistake from the past." He didn't elaborate. That night, he slept in his study, door bolted shut, a loaded gun on the desk. He dreamed of the forest, branches reaching for his legs, a child's face half buried in leaves, whispering, "Why did you leave me?" He woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. The next day, he ordered motion sensors and infrared scanners. "This house is a fortress," he muttered to himself. But each wall he built only made the house feel smaller, colder, more like a cage. From across the street, inside a rented apartment with an unobstructed view of the estate, Elian watched the mansion's transformation. He observed the new guards, the patrol shifts, the vehicle rotations. He noted when lights went off and on, when curtains shifted, when packages arrived. He kept a detailed log of Claudio's behaviors, his agitation, paranoia, inconsistencies. Elian could see the fear blooming inside him like a slow-growing poison. But something inside Elian had started to shift as well. Each move he made, each message sent, brought less satisfaction. The image of Claudio breaking down used to fuel him. Now it lingered strangely. Not with guilt, he didn't feel that, but with emptiness. One night, he wrote a message in his notebook. "What happens after he falls? Will I be free, or just alone with the pieces?" He tore the page out and burned it. He couldn't afford doubt. Not now. Still, when he saw... Claudio's hands trembled during a televised interview. Elian didn't smile like before. He just watched, measured, waited. The fire hadn't gone out. It had just become quieter. Helena began to notice things that didn't make sense. Drawers left open, objects slightly moved, passwords reset. "Claudio, we need to talk," she said one afternoon, her voice firm. "We're not safe here. You're unraveling, and no one knows why. Tell me the truth." He stared at her, eyes sunken, skin pale. "He's back," Claudio whispered. "The boy, the one I left." Her face froze. "What boy?" Claudio stood up, hands trembling. "Our son." Helena's face contorted with disbelief. "You told me he died at birth." Claudio looked away. "I lied." That word, so small, so final, hung between them like a noose. She stepped back, as if the room had become toxic. "You abandoned your child?" she asked, voice cracking. Claudio nodded once, then turned away. She didn't speak again. She just left the room, and when the door clicked shut, Claudio felt something snap, the last illusion of control. That night, he ripped the cameras from the walls himself, screaming, "You want to watch? Watch me burn." But no one came to stop him, not even the guards. They were used to the madness by now. Elian watched Helena leave the house the next morning with 2 suitcases. He didn't follow her. She wasn't part of his plan. But the image stayed in his mind longer than it should have. Later, he walked to a quiet cafe and pulled out the latest article on Claudio's campaign. The senator had cancelled another public appearance, citing family illness. The poll numbers were slipping. Allies distanced themselves. Rumors of mental instability swirled online. Elian could have released the documents by now, could have ended it all with a press leak. But that wasn't the goal. Claudio had to feel every brick of his empire crumble, one by one. Elian took out a clean sheet of paper and wrote a name, Maria Estela, Claudio's most trusted advisor. He began crafting her downfall next. He would make Claudio watch everyone close to him fall. He'd force him into isolation, into doubt, until he begged for it to stop. Then, and only then, Elian would reveal who he was, and let the man choke on the memory. The next nightmare came without warning. Claudio saw the child again, but older this time, standing over him, eyes full of judgment, not pain. "You thought I wouldn't find you?" the boy asked, voice clear, cold. "You buried me, but I grew under the ground." Claudio screamed himself awake, tears streaming down his face. The sheets were torn, his nails bloodied from scratching his own chest. The doctor he called said it was stress, prescribed stronger medication. Claudio flushed the pills and instead drank himself unconscious. In the hallway mirror, he saw the child again. Just a flash, but enough. He punched the glass, shattering his reflection. When the staff found him the next morning, he was on the floor, muttering. Nonsense, blood running down his wrist. Elian read the report online, then closed the laptop. No joy, no victory, just quiet. That night, he lay on his bed staring at the ceiling. For the first time, he asked himself if the monster he wanted to destroy was really the one inside the mansion, or the one staring back in the mirror. The following week, Elian walked past a toy store downtown. A boy stood at the window, pointing at a stuffed dog. Elian paused. The child's laughter reminded him of something distant, unreachable, a fragment of memory from before the forest, before Norberto. He walked. Away quickly, ashamed. That night, he returned to his notebook. He stared at Claudio's name for a long time before writing beneath it, "If I kill him, what do I become?" He didn't burn the page. He left it open, staring at the question until sleep took him. The plan was still in motion. The damage was done. But now, for the first time, Elian wasn't sure who he was hurting more, Claudio or himself. "Move, now!" Elian shouted as he pushed through the alley's narrow passage, breath ragged, feet pounding over uneven pavement. Behind him, angry voices shouted in pursuit. 2 men, maybe 3. He didn't bother to look back. He knew how to vanish, how to cut corners tight enough to disappear into shadows. This time had been too close. He'd underestimated the security of the storage unit where he'd planted one of his diversions. He turned left sharply, hurtling over a pile of crates, and ducked behind a dumpster, crouching low. The footsteps passed by. He waited, counted to 30, then emerged slowly, eyes scanning. That's when he heard it, not the voices of his pursuers, but something smaller, a whimper, not the kind made by animals or stray dogs. It was human. It was pain. Cautiously, Elian followed the sound into a side alley, barely wide enough for a person to walk through. There, near the base of a brick wall, he found a boy. He couldn't have been older than 7. His face was bloodied, lips swollen, one eye nearly shut. His arms were wrapped around his knees, trembling. Pieces of torn cloth clung to his body like someone had tried to strip him of more than just his dignity. Elian froze. His first instinct was to leave, walk away. He'd seen kids like that before, dozens, maybe hundreds. Bike-Chaussée had been full of them. Most were broken, forgotten, easy to ignore. But this boy, something in the way he held himself, shaking but silent, triggered something Elian hadn't felt in years. He knelt slowly, careful not to frighten the boy. "Hey," he said softly, keeping his voice low. "What happened?" The child didn't answer, just looked up with a single open eye full of terror and confusion. Elian recognized that look. It was the same one he'd had the night. Norberto had dragged him from the forest, promising safety but delivering chains. "Who did this to you?" Elian asked. Again, no answer, only that vacant, broken stare. He sighed, ran a hand through his hair, and glanced around. No one was coming back for this kid. No one was looking. The blood on. The wall suggested the gang had beaten him for fun, maybe used him as bait. "You got a name?" The boy blinked slowly. "Noah," he whispered. Elian's jaw tensed. He had 2 options. Walk away and pretend he hadn't seen anything, or do the one thing he'd sworn never to do again, care. He removed his jacket and carefully draped it over the boy's shoulders. "Can you walk?" he asked. Noah nodded weakly. Elian helped him up, supporting his weight as the child leaned against him. Every step made the boy wince, and Elian could feel how light he was, skin over bone, starved and bruised. They moved, slowly through the back streets, avoiding major roads, blending into silence. Elian didn't speak again until they reached a bus stop outside the old district. "We're going somewhere safe, you understand?" Noah nodded again, barely. Elian pulled a cap over the boy's head to hide his injuries. The bus arrived, and they boarded without questions. Elian paid in cash and sat near the back. The boy slumped beside him. As the city passed by outside, Elian stared ahead, fists clenched in his lap. He didn't know why he was doing this. He didn't have time. He had plans, missions. He didn't save people. But something about this boy, it was like looking into a cracked mirror. He remembered being that small, that hopeless, and he remembered the only person who had ever shown him kindness when he didn't deserve it. Iratsi. Casa Lumen stood on the edge of the city, hidden between government buildings and decaying houses. It didn't look like much, an old two-story structure with peeling paint and a crooked sign, but Elian knew what it was. A refuge. The place where, years ago, after escaping Norberto for the first time, he'd collapsed on the doorstep and been taken in by a woman who asked no questions and offered only silence and warm food. Irasi had never pried into his wounds. She had let him sleep, and when he'd run away 2 weeks later, she hadn't chased him. She had simply said, "If you ever need light again, you know where to find it." He hadn't returned, until now. As he approached the gate, Noah leaning into his side, Elian felt something tighten in his chest. Regret, maybe. Shame. He rang the bell. A few moments passed before the door opened. Iratsi appeared, older now, her silver hair tied back, her eyes just as sharp. She took one look at the boy and said, "Nothing." Then her gaze met Elian's. "You remember where you are," she said quietly. Elian nodded. "I need you to take him, please." Her expression softened. "Come in." Inside, Casa Lumen smelled of soap and old wood. Children's drawings lined the walls. The place hadn't changed much. Irasi led them to a small infirmary room and began cleaning Noah's wounds without asking questions. Elian stood by the door, arms crossed, watching. When she finished, she turned to him. "You look older. You look exactly the same," he replied. She chuckled faintly. "Not even close." There was a long pause. Then she asked, "Why him?" Elian didn't answer right away. "Because someone should have done the same for me." She nodded once, as if she had always known this moment would come. "You're not staying, are you?" "No," he said, "but I'll come back." She tilted her head. "For him or for you?" Elian didn't answer. He just looked at Noah, now sleeping on the cot, fingers curled into the jacket Elian had given him. Something in that gesture pierced deeper than any wound. Irasi approached, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You saved him, whether you wanted to or not." Elian nodded, but his face was a war of conflict. Saving the boy had opened something in him, something dangerous. That night, Elian sat alone on a park bench near the orphanage, staring at his notebook. Claudio's name was still there, underlined, circled, surrounded by arrows and words like leverage, exposure, collapse. But for the first time, he didn't write anything. He just stared at the page. He thought about Noah's face, about the moment the boy had whispered his name like it was a confession. He thought about the alley, the blood, the silence. He remembered every time he'd been left behind, beaten, ignored, and he wondered how many other children were still out there, still bleeding in silence. He could burn Claudio's world to the ground, but would that stop another Noah from appearing? He closed the notebook and sat in silence. He had work to finish, a monster to ruin. But now there was something else, stirring in him, a need not just to destroy, but maybe to rebuild. He returned to Casa Lumen early the next morning, just as the staff were serving breakfast. Irasi greeted him with a nod, then gestured silently toward the dining room. Noah sat at a long wooden table with other children, a bandage across his cheek, spooning porridge with slow, focused movements. When he saw Elian, his face lit up, not with a smile, but with recognition. Elian approached, unsure what to say. Before he could speak, Noah reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded jacket, holding it out like a sacred object. Elian knelt, taking it gently. "Thanks," he muttered. Noah nodded. "Are you going to leave?" Elian didn't lie. "Yes, but not for good." The boy looked down at his bowl, then back up. "Can I be like you one day?" The question hit him hard. He had no answer. "Maybe better," he said, then stood, turned, and walked out. He didn't look back, but for the first time in years he wanted to. "You finally grew a spine, huh?" Norberto grunted, lighting a cigarette with shaking fingers as he leaned back in the torn armchair. The small room reeked of sweat, alcohol, and old vengeance. Elian stood across from him, silent, still. He had told himself this moment would be simple. He'd walk in, confront the man who had stolen his childhood, broken his body, and used him like a pawn, and then walk out with closure. But nothing about Norberto was ever simple. "You think just 'cause you grew a few muscles and learned how to talk like a man, you can come in here and scare me?" Norberto chuckled, smoke curling from his nostrils. Elian didn't answer. He dropped a thick envelope onto the table between them. Norberto's eyes narrowed. "What's this?" "Everything," Elian said flatly. "Documents, names, routes, every child you trafficked, every cop you paid. You're done." Norberto froze. The bravado faded for a second, then returned in a bitter smile. "And what? You think they'll believe a little crippled bastard like you? You're nothing. I made you." Elian's jaw clenched. "Exactly. You made me, but I'm not yours anymore." Norberto stood up slowly, cracking his knuckles. "So, that's it then? You came here to play hero? You think handing me to the cops erases everything?" He stepped forward, eyes gleaming with the same menace that had haunted Elian's childhood. "I fed you, trained you. You'd be dead in a ditch if it wasn't for me." Elian didn't flinch. "And how many others ended up in that ditch because of you?" Norberto's laugh came out sharp. "That's how the world works, boy. The weak get used. Better by me than by someone worse." Elian shook his head. "That's the excuse of every monster." Norberto lunged then, hand raised to strike like he had done 100 times before. But Elian moved first, quick, precise. He grabbed the man's wrist mid-air, twisted it, and shoved him hard against the wall. Norberto groaned, surprised by the strength. "You don't get to touch me again," Elian hissed, breathing heavily. Norberto struggled, but the years of alcohol and arrogance had slowed him. Elian had trained for this moment, not for revenge, but to be free. The fight that followed wasn't long. Norberto swung blindly, fueled by rage. Elian dodged, countered, and landed a hard punch to the ribs that sent the older man stumbling backward. He didn't fight like a child anymore. He fought with purpose. Every blow was calculated, controlled. When Norberto fell to his knees, wheezing, Elian stepped back. He could finish it. He had imagined this so many times, standing over him, making him beg. But now that the moment was real, he didn't feel triumph, just exhaustion. "Do it," Norberto spat, blood at the corner of his mouth. "Finish it, you little coward." Elian stared at him for a long time. Then he turned, walked to the table, picked up the envelope, and dialed a number on his burner phone. "This is Elian. I have proof of child trafficking, murder, extortion. The man's name is Norberto Sousa. He's in the building right now." He hung up. Norberto stared at him, confused. "You're walking away." "No," Elian said, looking him in the eye. "I'm letting the world see what you are. Rot in a cage." The police arrived 17 minutes later. Elian didn't wait to see them cuff Norberto. He watched from a rooftop across the street as officers swarmed the building. Norberto shouted, cursed, resisted, but it didn't matter. Elian had submitted the evidence digitally hours before. Testimonies, audio recordings, bank transfers, everything. Meticulously organized. This wasn't vengeance, it was justice. As they dragged Norberto away, Elian didn't feel lighter. There was no celebration, only silence. For the first time in years, he was truly free of Norberto's grip. But freedom came with emptiness, without the man who had dictated his survival for over a decade. There was space now, space he didn't know how to fill. He turned and walked down the stairs slowly, disappearing into the night, the last screams of his former captor fading behind him. He returned to Casa Lumen before dawn. Irasi was already awake, sitting with a cup of tea and her usual knowing expression. "It's done?" she asked. Elian nodded. "He's going to prison. The evidence is sealed. He can't talk his way out." She said nothing for a while, just sipped her tea. "And how do you feel?" Elian shrugged. "I thought I'd feel something, relief, rage, but I don't. It's like part of me was built to fight him. Now that he's gone, I don't know what I am." Irasi stood, walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're someone who lived. That's enough for now." Elian looked at her, eyes tight. "I still have one more." She nodded. "Claudio." He didn't respond. He didn't have to. She sighed. "You know the path you're on. Just don't forget, you're allowed to leave it." The next morning, Elian watched the news. Norberto's arrest had made headlines. Reporters called it a breakthrough in child exploitation investigations. The authorities praised an anonymous whistleblower. His photo wasn't anywhere. He had made sure of that. But something else caught his attention. A headline about Claudio Valenza cancelling all future public appearances and retreating from politics for health reasons. Elian smirked. The collapse had begun before the final blow. He closed the laptop and stood. It was time. Norberto was gone. The past no longer held him captive, but one ghost still remained, not in the shadows, not in old files, but in blood. Claudio Valenza, the man who created the wound, the man who still had to look his son in the eyes and answer for it. Elian packed his things. He didn't bring weapons. He didn't need them. The sharpest blade he carried was the truth. At the edge of the city, in a modest apartment, Elian reviewed the final plan. Every route, every entry point. He knew Claudio's movements better than his own. The security was lighter now. Most guards dismissed, surveillance disabled. Paranoia had eroded everything, but this wouldn't be a quiet infiltration. This would be a confrontation, face to face, no masks, no more games. Elian stood by the window staring at the skyline. The sun was rising, golden and merciless. He thought of Norberto one last time, not with hate, but finality. That chapter was closed. The man was in a cage where monsters belonged. And Elian, he was walking into the last fire, not to burn, but to decide what remained of himself when the flames were gone. "Don't move." Elian's voice was steady, almost quiet, but it landed like a blade between Claudio's ribs. The senator froze mid-motion, half rising from his chair before dropping back down, as if the weight of the past had suddenly returned to his shoulders. The mansion's grand living room, its velvet, curtains, marble floors, curated bookshelves, meant nothing now, not under the gaze of the boy he'd abandoned. Claudio's face contorted in disbelief as Elian stepped into the light, pulling back his hood. "You know who I am," Elian said, his eyes sharp and unrelenting. "Don't lie." Claudio's mouth opened and closed, useless. "It's not possible," he whispered, voice dry. "The boy, he was gone, he died." Elian took another step forward. "You left him to die." But he didn't. He grew up. He learned to hate. He learned to survive. Claudio shrank into his seat, the echo of power fading from his posture. "I didn't know. I didn't mean for... It was a different time," he stammered, the polished rhetoric of a senator disintegrating into cowardice. Elian's silence was louder than any scream. He didn't need to say it. Claudio had always known the truth would come back one day. He just never imagined it would speak. Claudio raised his hands slowly, not in defense, but in surrender. "I was young, afraid. My career was on the line, my reputation. People wouldn't have understood." He spoke like he was trying to convince himself more than Elian. "You were broken. I thought it better for you, better than being hidden, caged, hated." Elian laughed, a bitter, breathless sound. "You didn't think of me at all. You thought of yourself, your office, your legacy, and you left a 3-year-old boy in the middle of nowhere like trash. Claudio flinched, eyes glossy. I paid for it, he whispered. I've paid for it every day since. Elian stepped closer, towering over him now. You haven't paid anything yet. Claudio's breathing grew shallow. What do you want? Revenge? Blood? Elian pulled a pistol from under his coat, not aiming it, just holding it. Claudio's eyes widened. In panic. Please, he begged. I'm sorry, I truly am. If I could undo it. Elian cut him off. But you can't. You don't get to undo what you did. You live with it, like I did. For a long, tense moment, Elian stared at the gun. His fingers tightened around the grip, his thumb brushing over the trigger. The temptation was real. One pull and it would all be over. No more games, no more nightmares, just justice, brutal and final. But as he looked at Claudio, hunched, trembling, eyes full of tears and rot, he felt something else rising, something colder than hate. You're already dead, he said. You just don't know it yet. Then he lowered the gun. Claudio stared at him, stunned. You're not going to kill me? Elian shook his head. That's too easy. I want you to wake up every day remembering what you did. I want you to feel the walls close in. I want you to look in the mirror and see my face instead of yours. Claudio began to sob, real and uncontrollable, collapsing into himself. Elian stepped back, his expression blank. You sentenced me to a life in the dark. Now I'm giving you the same. Before he left the house, Elian placed a USB drive on the senator's desk. Everything's on there, he said without looking back. The evidence, the names, the money, you'll be in handcuffs by the end of the week. Claudio didn't respond. He couldn't. He was curled up in the chair, mumbling apologies to ghosts. Elian walked through the mansion without fear. No guards stopped him. No alarms rang. The house had long since stopped being a fortress. It was a prison now, and Claudio was its last prisoner. Outside, Elian didn't pause. He crossed the gates like a man shedding skin. The air didn't feel different. He didn't feel free, but he felt finished. The last piece had fallen, and now all that was left was to watch it rot. 3 days later, the news broke. Senator Claudio Valenza was arrested in his home, indicted on charges of corruption, embezzlement, abuse of power, and obstruction of justice. The footage showed him handcuffed, led away by agents in silence. No speech, no farewell, just shame. The media exploded, allies vanished, his empire collapsed in real time. Elian watched it on a cracked screen in a small apartment, unmoved. He didn't smile, he didn't speak, he just watched. When the screen went black, he sat in silence, surrounded by empty walls and a future he hadn't yet defined. The monster was gone, but the scars remained. Later that night, Elian walked to Casa Lumen. The porch light was on. Irasi waited by the doorway. She didn't say anything, just opened the door wider. Elian stepped inside, not as a ghost, not as a weapon, but as something closer to human. He didn't know what would come next. He didn't know who he was without the war. But maybe, just maybe, he'd find out. Slow down, Lucas. You're going to spill the food, one of the caregivers shouted as a group of children raced down the hallway, laughter and small footsteps filling the air. Elian stood by the doorway, arms crossed, his face relaxed in a way he barely recognized in himself. For weeks, this place had become more than a temporary shelter. It was a bridge, not to forget what he had lived through, but to start something different. Since the fall of Claudio and the imprisonment of Norberto, he had left behind the shadows, the weapons, and the obsession with revenge. Instead, he used his skills to find children in danger, expose abusive shelters, and offer something he never had: presence. He never introduced himself with a full name. To most, he was just the man with the backpack, or the stranger in the black coat who showed up in the alley. But to the kids, he became something else. They started calling him the man who listens. And he did listen. He sat on the floor with them, eye to eye, without judgment. He didn't promise them miracles. He simply looked at each of them as if to say, I know exactly how it feels. Donations began pouring in after Elian anonymously sent evidence of abuse, corruption, and negligence within several child welfare institutions to NGOs and serious journalists. Within months, places like Casa Lumen received funding, renovations, and trained staff. No one knew who was behind it. That's how Elian preferred it. He wasn't looking for credit. The name Valença had died alongside the man who carried it. Now he existed in the margins, helping where he could and disappearing before anyone asked too many questions. When Irasi asked him one morning if he planned on staying permanently, he simply shook his head with a half-smile. "Not yet," he said. "There are still kids out there in places no one wants to look. I know those streets better than anyone." She didn't press further. She just kept his room ready, always set a second cup of tea, and left the porch light on at night. He came and went like a shadow, but she knew, sooner or later, he would stay. One afternoon, after a meeting with a child protection group, Elian noticed a girl sitting alone outside the building, holding a stuffed animal that had clearly seen better days. "You waiting for someone?" he asked, crouching to her level. She shrugged. "My mom said she'd come back, but it's been a while." He didn't ask anything else. He sat beside her. They waited in silence for nearly 2 hours. No one came. Eventually, Elian stood and offered her his hand. "There's a place where the food's hot, the beds are clean, and no one's going to leave you behind. You want to see it?" The girl looked at him for a moment, then reached for his hand. She didn't know it, but she was accepting more than shelter. She was accepting a gesture from someone who had once sat just like that, waiting for someone who never came. In that moment, Elian understood something he hadn't before. He wasn't just the one who survived. He was now someone who could keep others alive too. Months passed. In Porto Medonho, rumors began to spread. Whispers of a man who showed up in forgotten corners, pulled kids out of gang traps and burned down squats, and disappeared before anyone could thank him. They said he had the eyes of someone who'd lived through hell, but hands that never harmed. Some said he was an ex-convict. Others claimed he was the disowned son of a fallen politician. No one knew for sure. Elian made sure of that. Once a journalist tried to follow him and snapped a photo of him, handing a boy over to a clinic. The next morning, the reporter's phone was wiped clean, and in its place, a note appeared on his desk. "I'm not the story. They are." He understood, and never tried again. One Sunday morning, Elian returned to Casa Lumen unannounced. Irasi was trimming the bushes by the garden. 3 weeks without a word. "I figured you'd vanished for good this time," she said with a slight grin. "Still around," he replied, taking off his backpack. "There's someone I want to see." He walked down the familiar hallway. Inside the dining room, the voices of children filled the space. And there, sitting at the table between 2 younger boys, was Noah, taller now, hair neatly combed, a fresh bandage on his arm, but the face was different. There was light in it. When Noah saw him, he jumped from his chair and ran. "You came back," he said. Elian knelt, arms open, and the boy wrapped around him like he never wanted to let go. "How are you?" Elian asked, pulling back just enough to see his face. "I'm good. I help the little ones now, just like you." Elian nodded. "You'll be better than me." And for the first time, he believed it. Noah ran back to his seat, but sitting down, he turned and shouted across the room, "Are you staying today?" Elian hesitated. It was a simple question, and for the first time in years, he wanted to say yes. He didn't. Instead, he gave the boy something else, something he'd never given anyone before. He smiled, not a smirk, not a grim line, a real, quiet, human smile, one that didn't come from pain or survival, but from something new, peace. Noah grinned back, then returned to his breakfast. Elian watched him for a long moment, something warm growing in the place where, for years, there had only been ash. Later, he sat on the garden bench while Irasi brought him tea. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The world was still cruel. There were still monsters, still broken children in hidden corners. But here, right now, there was a boy inside smiling without fear, and a man outside who had learned to live without hate. Elian breathed in slowly. The past was still there, but it no longer chained him. And for the first time in his life, the future didn't look like a battlefield. It looked like possibility, the end. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to Golden Stories for more powerful tales like this one. Hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and send this video to someone who needs to see it. Your support helps us bring more stories to life.